Lech Lecha is this week's Parsha. It is the most important Parsha for anyone who likes to study Torah because it is the foundational Parsha of Abraham and Sarah, of the Jewish people. When we say 4,000 years, that we've been around for 4,000 years, we use Abraham and Sarah as the first two Jewish people who, in fact, lived roughly 4,000 years ago. So everything up until now is prehistoric. The story of creation, the story of Noah, are all part of our story as well, but specific to us as Jewish people is this week's Parsha Lech Lecha. And as many of you know, because you love that Debbie Friedman song, Lechi Lach, here's what the Parsha says in the beginning regarding the covenant, the brit that God enters into with Abraham and Sarah, who at the beginning of the portion are called Avram and Sarah. Avram and Sarai. And here's what God says. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those that curse you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. And then we learn Abraham took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all of the wealth that they had amassed and the people that they had acquired in Haran, which is where they were at the time, and they set out for the land of Canaan. The command at the beginning of the Torah portion is Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'memoladetecha. God says, get out of the land that you were born in and go to the land that I will show you. The Torah is very explicit in that it doesn't waste words. And what happens is these words that I just read follow that command. In other words, there's no idea as to how Abraham thought, felt, or envisioned his life after this point. He does, and Sarai goes with, what God tells him to do. He gets up, he leaves. We are given no details. He doesn't ask a question according to the Torah. He doesn't ask for directions, which is genetic for those of us who are Jewish men. Sarai's probably yelling at him the whole time, just pull over, ask someone. He doesn't hesitate. He gets up and he goes. And not only that, Abram, according to the Torah, was sort of a popular, charismatic guy. He takes people along with him. The people who he acquired, according to the Torah, these souls that he acquired were what we would later call Moses taking the mixed multitude. That people had always been attracted to the Jewish people, to the people of Abraham and Sarah, and sort of wanted to hang out with them and go along for the journey. But he's silent. He's unwavering. He is obedient. Abraham is the picture-perfect person when it comes to loyalty. And so that is the first thing we learned about what it means to be Jewish from Abraham and Sarai. We learn that loyalty, obedience, if you will, taking directions without hesitation, that all of these things are of our most fundamental principles. First and foremost is this mission that we have as Jews, to listen and to act and to do it unwaveringly. And so it leads us to a question when it comes to looking at Abraham and Sarai of what is Jewish faith? Not just the component parts of Jewish faith, but why is it that Judaism isn't a religion per se, a religion or a faith per se, but a people, an idea, a civilization, as Mordechai Kaplan called it. What is Jewish faith exactly? This is a question that I know is confusing for many of us. We hear certain things and we think that's Jewish faith. Or we see certain things and we think that's Jewish faith. And I'm never, ever, how do I put this? I am always surprised by people who say, I'm not that religious, but I'm spiritual. Like, what does that mean? It means that we have preconceived ideas that are often incomplete when it comes to the idea of faith. So let's talk about faith for just a moment through the lens of Abraham and Sarai. Loyalty is part of faith. And what does that mean? Faith is a willingness to trust despite one's doubts and through one's tensions. Faith is trust. Loyalty is trust. The most simple reading of this verse from the Bible, from the Torah, is that God reckoned Abraham to trust him, to trust in God. Rashi, who's one of our great commentators of Jewish history from about roughly 1,000 years ago, notes that God credited Abraham's trust to his tzedakah, to his righteousness, because Abraham did not ask God one question. This was, according to Rashi, what made him a tzaddik. A tzaddik is almost like a perfect person, a fully righteous person. And so part of Jewish faith is not to be a perfect person, but to be righteous, loyal, trustworthy, righteous. A more recent biblical work, something called the Torah Tamima from the 19th century, understands this ambiguous sentence about faith and what it is that Abraham did with regard to trusting and being loyal. He understands this sentence differently. He says that Abraham trusts God and considered God's promise itself as evidence of God's righteousness. That we often take for granted that we live in a habitable universe. The sun rises and sets with predictable regularity. The earth produces material with which in turn nourishes us and all other living things. And human beings are able to produce and raise children to an adulthood. And so what Rabbi Epstein, the author of Torah Tamima, teaches is that we should not take anything for granted. That part of faith is the ability to not only acquire things, to have food that grows and to have children that come after us and to raise them and to live amongst all living things, but that we never take anything for granted. Jews are, by the way, environmentalists because of this. In our DNA, in our religious DNA, we are environmentalists because we believe that when you look at the environment around you, every single aspect of it is proof of God's existence and therefore needs to be cared for. While the world may be far from perfect, it is nonetheless regular. It is reliable. The sun comes up in the morning and it goes down at night. These are the things, lest we take for granted, that give us proof of God's existence. So part of Jewish faith, in other words, that one's a little trickier. Part of Jewish faith is not to take things for granted. To remember that the world, while it isn't perfect, is reliable, vital, and that is evidence of God's existence, and also for Abraham of God's promise. One way of understanding the verse, then, is to see it in God's willingness to trust Abraham. The rabbis teach us that God picks Abraham not only for the reasons that I said before, but also because of Abraham's potential, because he's a leader. He acts the way that God wants others to act. He behaves in the ways of righteousness and loyalty and trust, and people will pursue this, the understanding is, if Abraham is our numero uno, our number one. Finally, one other way to read the verse is to recognize Abraham's willingness in the reverse to trust God. Both are very far from predictable. Both represent little miracles, but there is insight in both of these readings, but not tension. Abraham and God present faith as a willingness to trust despite the reality of setbacks and suffering. Rather than some pale recital of a creed, Judaism insists on a rich trust demonstrated not by spreading the word, but by living the deeds, living in the world and of the world. So let's wrap this up and bring it together. We've got trust, we've got loyalty, we've got the idea of not taking things for granted, of being connected and plugged into the evolving nature of our universe and of our world, of not taking things for granted, of looking around us and seeing God in all of it. But this other very cool idea, I think, is that God trusts us. The other piece of the covenant is that God puts trust in us, that we will, because of Abraham and Sarai's example, live a life of righteousness and of loyalty and of trustworthiness. On this Shabbat, I want you to think about this because I think it's going back to that line that people say all the time, I'm not that religious, but I'm spiritual. How many of us define Judaism as praying 3 times a day, keeping kosher, fasting on Yom Kippur, on ritual, on piety, and then say, I'm not any of that, and therefore I'm not that religious or observant? But I believe in loyalty and trust and faith and hope. I'm an environmentalist. I look at the world around me and I don't take it for granted and know that we have to do everything in our power to make sure the earth works properly. That's our part of the bargain. How many of us think, God, I don't keep kosher and therefore I'm not that Jewish? I don't pray 3 times a day and therefore I'm not that Jewish. I don't wear a yarmulke on my head all day and therefore I'm not that Jewish, but I'm really spiritual. I would make the argument that Abraham did not pray 3 times a day. He didn't keep kosher. We know this because in next week's Torah portion, he boils lamb in its mother's milk as a meal for the angels who come to visit him. He doesn't know from kashrut. I would argue that Abraham doesn't sit praying 3 times a day, keeping kosher. He doesn't even observe Jewish holidays. Abraham and Sarai don't do any of those things that we identify as being religious or Jewish. But they are righteous. They do make good decisions. They are natural leaders because they are trustworthy and loyal, and they define what faith ultimately is. They define for us what it means to be part of the peoplehood of Israel. So, piety and righteousness are different things, and I would argue, based on what we've learned tonight, that Judaism is more about righteousness than it is about piety. And so if you consider yourself one who is attempting to achieve righteousness, one who visits the sick, one who cares about the earth, one who cares about the poor, one who makes connections with people because you see the godliness in them, one who is trustworthy and gives trust and pursues justice, you're much more religious, much more Jewish than you think. Shabbat Shalom.